Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I thought that I would discuss something a little bit different this week. I recently had the opportunity to watch the pilot episode of Westworld, the new program there on HBO. I was pretty happy with it. I'm more familiar with the film that was made in 1973, so any discussion about Westworld that I'll be talking about here will deal more with that than the more recent television show. But I was pretty happy with this pilot episode, especially the acting. The acting really amazed me. But watching this episode got me started thinking, and that's something like good science fiction does. Good science fiction is not about explosions and special effects. We've kind of gotten off track in that way the last decade or two. We've misinterpreted what science fiction is meant to be. But this program was an example of what I would call good science fiction. Good science fiction makes you think. Some other examples of this. Star Trek specialized in making people think. Blade Runner. Avatar. Logan's Run. Even to a certain extent, Star Wars. Star Wars is not thought of as a thinking man's science fiction, but Star Wars does make you think about certain issues. It especially gets into that a little bit more in the much maligned prequels that people really didn't seem to like. I personally thought that the prequels were okay. They were nowhere near as much fun as the original trilogy was. But the prequels got you started thinking in terms of politics and how the people in power can manipulate, even orchestrate entire wars in order to get what they want. So I would classify Star Wars in this category. Even though Star Wars is extraordinarily popular, I don't know if I would call it one of the greats of science fiction, at least not at this point. It is a fun series of films. I personally enjoy watching Star Wars a great deal. But science fiction is really about taking you to a mental space that you've never been in before. Dune is a prime example of really good science fiction. But one of the things that really caught my attention about Westworld, once again, we're mostly talking about the film here, but the television show works with this too. One of the things that really got me started thinking about is the Frankenstein Mythos. And yes, most science fiction is based on the Frankenstein Mythos. Frankenstein Mythos, in its most simplistic terms, is the fear we have that we will not be able to control our creations. That's what the Frankenstein Mythos is. And any story that deals with the failure to control your own creations, you're delving into the Frankenstein Mythos. Now, the reason why it's called the Frankenstein Mythos is because the novel by Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, is generally regarded as the first use of this storytelling tool. I do not know if it actually is. I would be surprised if it is the original. It seems like pretty much everything that you come across that you think is the original turns out not to be at all. But the Frankenstein Mythos is named after Mary Shelley's Frankenstein because that's generally regarded as the first use of this storytelling tool. For those of you who do not already know, the story of Frankenstein is about a scientist named Victor Frankenstein who creates, for lack of a better term, a monster. He creates a being. He takes a corpse and uses electricity to bring life to it. And after creating this life, this monster, people will oftentimes refer to the monster as Frankenstein, but no, Frankenstein is the scientist who created the monster. Actually, I believe at one point during one of her interviews, Mary Shelley said that the monster's name was Adam. That's just a side note, but I believe that Mary Shelley actually said that the monster's name was Adam, which was a direct reference to Adam and Eve. But in the story itself, the monster was never given a name, which is one of the reasons why Victor Frankenstein thought of his creation as a monster. He never named him. So he always called him like demon and whatever else. But he was horrified by his creation, and he quickly lost control of his creation. His creation discovered that he terrified people. Although the monster was very intelligent, he was able to teach himself how to read and write. He was able to teach himself how to speak the local language. But the monster also quickly discovered that he horrified people. People were terrified by his appearance, and one day, when looking at his reflection, the monster realized why he terrified people the way he did. But anyway, Dr. Victor Frankenstein created this monster and promptly lost control of it. The monster demanded that Frankenstein make for him a wife, which the doctor did not want to do. He was afraid of what kind of children this coupling would produce. He considered it a threat to the human race. The monster grew to be very angry and hateful towards his creator. He started blaming Frankenstein for his problems, and a great deal of the story deals with the monster hunting down and attempting to destroy Victor Frankenstein. So, anyway, what I'm getting at here is this story is considered to be the original use of the Frankenstein mythos, the mythos where someone creates something and then loses all control of it. When you look at the science fiction that we have today, not just the recent stuff, but the stuff that we've been making for years, for decades, one of the most common storytelling tools that we use is the Frankenstein mythos. It is the fear of losing control of our creations. Blade Runner, that was Frankenstein mythos. So is the Terminator. So are the Matrix films. All of these are Frankenstein mythos. And of course, obviously, the story that got me started thinking on this subject recently, Westworld, is an example of the Frankenstein mythos. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the original Westworld movie, which keep in mind, the movie is based on a book by Michael Crichton. So the original movie was not the original Westworld. It was just the original film production of the story. But what the early 70s film of Westworld was about was it took place in the future. I don't think it designated a time. I don't remember it designating a year, which is a very smart thing for science fiction to do. When you're working science fiction, you don't want to give a year because that helps age it. Unless you're talking about Dune, which Dune names a year, but it's a year so far into the future that not even our civilization will be around at that time to remember it. So it doesn't really matter in the case of Dune. But in the case of Westworld, they did not give a year that I can remember. And in the quote-unquote future, there were 3 theme parks that people could visit. There was Westworld, there was Medieval World, and I think the third one was Roman World. I could be wrong about that. It could be Greek World instead. But you had these 3 theme parks, and they were staffed by robots that could impersonate human beings. Now, in the original film, they didn't look and move quite right. In the television show on HBO, the machines are as lifelike as the humans are. In the HBO television show, the machines are spot on accurate, or at least the current generation. They're spot on accurate in terms of the way they look and move. But in the original film, I think they made the intentional decision to keep the robots looking slightly off. They kind of silvered out the robots' eyes. They moved slightly mechanically. I think it was an intentional choice on the part of the director to make these machines in the movie not quite human looking. But these robots staffed these 3 theme parks, and the movie's called Westworld because the main characters from the film, they were tourists visiting Westworld. There were 2 of them, two guys, 2 best friends. They were going there to have a good time. And while they were in Westworld, they dressed up as cowboys, and they got into bar fights, and they took part in shootouts in the streets and things like that. They had guns that they were real working guns, but a supposed safety mechanism. One of the many things that went wrong in the movie is if you point the gun at an actual human being, it senses that this is a human being and it won't fire. Obviously, almost everything that I described went wrong in this film. So it's basically a film about, we made these machines, we went to a theme park, the machines all went wrong and started killing everybody, and that's what the plot is about, basically. If this sounds familiar to you, it did not rip off Jurassic Park, or Jurassic Park did not rip off Westworld, depending on how you look at it. Both of these are based on books written by Michael Crichton. It was the same guy, so he did not rip himself off. He was just using the same storytelling tool to tell different stories is all. But once again, this got me started thinking about the Frankenstein mythos. It is something that I've thought about in the past. It's just a subject matter that fascinates me, mainly because I would like to find a way to avoid the problems of the Frankenstein mythos. I mean, this is clearly a very real fear that we have buried in the backs of our subconscious somewhere. If we did not fear the loss of control of our creations, then it would not be such a successful plot device. But so I like to think to myself, what can we do to avoid this problem? It seems to me that the direction we're headed, assuming the human race manages to survive long enough, who knows, we will eventually create living things. We will eventually create machines that are self-aware. It is possible that we have done this already. With the internet being as vast an information network as it is completely possible that we could have accidentally produced a conscious entity living on the web somewhere. I'm not saying we have. I'm not even saying that it's likely we've done this. But this is a possibility. It's a possibility that we have already created a life form and we're unaware of it. So faced with the likelihood that we will probably, if we haven't already, produce a self-aware, a sentient being, we need to look at our options about how we're going to handle this. And I'd like us to do it now rather than waiting until it becomes a problem. See, what we as human beings, what we like to do, we're a very lazy species, let's be honest. We are very lazy. We prefer to ignore problems until they reach the point where it is no longer possible to ignore them. It just seems to me that if we wanted to avoid someday having a Terminator or Matrix-style rise of the machines, the best way to do it is to somehow solve the problem now before it becomes a problem. And there are different ways that we can do this. And keep in mind, I'm just throwing out ideas that I have thought of. I'm just throwing out the things that have occurred to me. I'm not saying that these are the right things. I'm not saying that they're the only options. I'm definitely not saying that they're the best options. I'm just simply describing the situation as I have seen it. But it seems to me that we have a few options on the table. The first option is ignore the whole situation, continue going the direction we're headed, let whatever happens happens, and deal with the consequences. Some of you out there, this might seem like a perfectly valid option. To me, it is not. So option number 2, we can make the decision to not produce technology that could ever produce any kind of sentience whatsoever. Only have technology that is not capable in any way, shape, or form of artificial intelligence. Well, we've already missed out on that. But that is one option we can go with. The book Dune actually dealt with that option. One of the things that happened in the history of the book Dune, it happened in the backstory. So you don't actually see this happening in the story itself, but you see the ramifications of this past playing out in the story. And that is that in the backstory of Dune, they did have a rise of the machines. They created artificial intelligence that almost overthrew the human race. There was a huge war fought, happened on a multiple planetary scale. Somehow the human beings won the war, and ever since then, the official religion, the official religious document of the Dune universe, it's called the Orange Catholic Bible. The Orange Catholic Bible actually has a commandment in it. I don't remember the exact wording, but it basically amounts to, "Thou shalt not create technology that mimics the mind of man." That's basically what it comes down to. And that's the reason why some of the things in the story Dune are the way they are. Mentats are people who have trained their minds to be so mathematical that they carry out the jobs that we use supercomputers for today. In the Dune universe, that's the job of the Mentat. The Mentat's job is to be a thinking machine. Their job is to do the job that a computer or an artificial intelligence would be doing if it was still legal and socially acceptable to make computers with artificial intelligence. Come to think of it, that's also the job that the Guild Steersman carries out. They carry out the job of plotting courses for the starships and everything. So the Frankenstein mythos also plays into Dune. And they have chosen this second option. Once again, first option, let things go the course they're going, and if war happens, if whatever happens, it happens. Basically, the lazy man's solution to the problem is to pretend that there is no problem. Kind of like what we see today in environmentalism, but I digress. Then, of course, the second option, do what they did in the story Dune and create a civilization based on technology that refuses to have anything to do with artificial intelligence. I don't consider that to be a very realistic option because, honestly, we're already on the way to breaking our promises there. We're already creating artificial intelligence and trying to make it as broad and powerful as we can. I don't see the average person being willing to give that technology up, not unless it's by force. The only way I see the average person giving up that technology is if some natural environmental disaster happens that sends our entire civilization back to square one. That's the only way I see the average person giving up the conveniences that are afforded to them by our artificial intelligence. So that gives us a third option that I can see. And I can tell you right now this will be a very unpopular option. but I consider it to be a strong option, a good option. And that option is we give our creations rights before they demand them. We don't wait until our creations have become self-aware and are ready to wage war on us in order to get what's rightfully theirs. And whether you say it's rightfully theirs or not is kind of an arbitrary thing to discuss, because anyone with the power to fight for their rights are going to do it. But that's the third option I can come up with. Give our creations rights now. But of course, as any of you hearing this is probably already thinking, there are problems with doing this. And the main problem is, at what point does a creation deserve rights? At what point is a creation sentient enough that the Bill of Rights is supposed to protect them? At what point does a being deserve the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? This is a question that we as a culture are going to have to answer. I'm not even going to pretend that I myself can come up with a definitive answer to this. It's just something that one person can't do. We all need to take this question into real consideration and answer it as a group. I think it's safe to say that a toaster does not deserve rights, or that a television deserves rights. But whether or not someone deserves rights should not be based on whether or not they can communicate that they deserve those rights. One of the reasons why we as a society likes to deny animals their rights is because they cannot speak, or at least they cannot speak in a way that we understand, and so we automatically label them as being lesser beings. They don't feel what we feel, they're not conscious the way we're conscious, so they don't deserve the same rights. I'm not going to discuss animal rights in this particular video, and not because I don't think it's a subject worthy of discussion. Animal rights is a subject that we need to discuss as well, but that's just not the line of thought that I am on for this recording. Right now I am talking in terms of our creations. And yes, animal rights will probably play into it once we are at the point where we are actively creating animals. But for right now, I'm thinking more in terms of machines. At what point does a machine gain sentience? And the ability to communicate, hey, I am sentient, that should not be the determining factor. Because first of all, we use the excuse that animals can't speak as the reason why we don't give them more rights. But at the same time, you look at slavery. The slaves of the past were perfectly capable of saying, hey, I'm sentient, I am aware, I think, therefore I am. And we just kind of ignored that and said that they weren't sentient anyway, just because we didn't want to hear it. But at what point does a creation have sentience? And how will we define that? Once again, this is not a question that I myself can answer. My main goal with this video is to get people thinking about it. It really is a question that we as a people will need to answer. And it's completely possible that we as a people will just say, fuck you, Dax, I don't want to think about this. Let's go on our merry way and let whatever happens happen. And if we choose to do that, I can only really control what I myself have done in the circumstance. I can't control what you have decided to do. But this is what I would like to see happen. I would like to see us grant rights to our creations before it becomes necessary for them to take those rights by force. I hope that this got you started thinking. Once again, I don't have the answers. I don't pretend to have the answers. But it is a question. I have a question that I would like us as a species to come up with an answer to. And I hope we do. I hope that we do not choose the lazy route of waiting until our creations become sentient and then waging war against their creators in order to get what is rightfully theirs. And that's one of the things about this. I don't want us to do this out of fear. I don't want us to do this out of the fear of a future war or our machines turning against us or anything. I want us to do this because it's the right thing to do. When you create something, you have a responsibility for that creation. We don't like to think of it that way. We don't like to think of anything as being our responsibility. Let's be honest here. I know that a lot of people who hear what I just said will probably argue with me on it until they're blue in the face. Doesn't change a damn thing. You create something, you have responsibility regarding it. You create a weapon, you're responsible for the way it is used. Even if you're not the one who pulls the trigger, you're the one who built the trigger. You create a computer, you're responsible for the way it's used. You create anything, you're responsible for the way it's used. And when you create a sentient, self-aware entity, regardless of what form that entity takes, you are responsible for that entity. You are responsible for the impact that entity has on the world. You are responsible for the quality of that entity's life. We are responsible for our creations, whether we want to be or not. So I hope that this got you started thinking. I'm going to leave this here. So you guys have yourselves a very good night. I wish you all the best. And I love you all. Thank you for listening.